Welcome. I'm Mike Nelson. I work here at Microsoft as a principal technology policy strategist. More importantly, I'm also very involved in the local chapter of the Internet Society, and very pleased that you could be here today. I'm very pleased that we have an audience out in webcast land, in the Twitterverse. This panel came together very, very quickly. David Brin is an old friend of mine, and he told me he was coming to town and offered to do an event with the chapter, and we quickly pulled together an all-star panel of people to talk about the topic confidentiality. Will we be able to keep secrets in the future? And what does it mean? What does it mean if a Swiss bank a Swiss bank can't even keep its records secret anymore? The State Department has 200,000 memos that leak out courtesy of WikiLeaks. So we're going to debate the question whether transparency is inevitable. If it is, what will happen? How will that change society? How will it change government? How will it change corporations? And if you don't believe transparency is inevitable, what is going to happen? One of our panelists who will be joining us shortly, Mark Rasch, is an expert in cybersecurity and actually argues the other way, that we're going to find ways to lock down information. This is going to be a very informal discussion. It's designed to be a round table, although we have no table. We do have a great set of experts as well as a very good audience with lots of questions. So this is going to be no slides, no speeches, just back and forth conversation. I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to just give us the short, 90 seconds of who they are and why they care about confidentiality, and then we'll dive into the topic. So, David?
Oh, yes, right. Yeah, I'm David Brin. I'm in town because of the big gala at the Reagan Center over the weekend. Brian Greene, Patrick Stewart, and all that about science fiction and the future. So that's looking, a little farther ahead. And but this other hat that I wear is as author of The Transparent Society: Will Technology Make Us Choose Between Freedom and Privacy? Which is hardly a field that you'd expect an astrophysicist or a science fiction author to go into, but I got very bugged attending computers, freedom and privacy discussions and Internet Society discussions in the 90s by what seemed to me to be an obvious following of a mentality in a direction that did not pay any attention to what got us our freedom, why we're here able to hold these discussions, why we're able to be resentful of apparent declines in privacy and freedom. You have to look at the basic backdrop first and see the context within it's all happening. And we have this freedom for certain reasons that I think have been, to a large extent, overlooked.
So Tom Lee, who's the director of the Sunlight Labs, which is part of the Sunlight Foundation, and a return speaker here with the Internet Society. He's been with us before.
That's right. The Labs is an engineering department of Sunlight. Sunlight, as a whole, is a transparency organization devoted to making government more accountable. We feel that information is a fundamental input to democratic processes, and that more of it makes the system work better. In the Labs, we're in a unique position to employ technology toward that mission. And of course, it is technology that's bringing us here today to talk about how the flow of information has been changed. So I'm very glad to be a part of that conversation.
Next to him is Elin, who is a serial entrepreneur, former chief data officer at the Federal Communications Commission, and doing something really crazy and exciting now.
Wow, I think you took all of my punchlines. So
no, you got the punchline.
I came to DC with the Sunlight Foundation and was a predecessor of Tom Lee's before a secret coup took place. No, just kidding. And worked as a chief data officer, very interested in opening up information, because I think that the internet has taught us that there's a very interesting dynamic when not only information is open, but there's open participation. And I'm here because I have some confidential information on Mike Nelson, which I'm trying to figure out whether it's going to be valuable 20 years from now or not.
Use it now, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Allan Holmes is an old friend, and he's been writing about technology in various information technology journals and newspapers. We worked together at Bloomberg Government, and now he's with the Center for Public Integrity, which makes a living exposing secrets.
That's right. The Center for Public Integrity is, although it doesn't sound like it, it is an organization of investigative journalists. And what we do is we look at how money and power influence public policy, typically not in the public interest. Do very similar things that what the Sunlight Foundation does. What we do is we like to crunch big data sets to try to find correlations or uncover the eurekas or show something where something is moving. And all that is getting more and more electronic and getting access to that, and really truly believes that if you can show who's doing what and spending what and how that affects public policy, that's a good thing.
And finally, Barry Pavel is at the Atlantic Council, where he is the director of the Scowcroft Center. He's coming from the national security side of the house.
Yeah, I'm a former government bureaucrat, and I'm here to help. No, we, at the Scowcroft Center, I spent 15 years in the Pentagon and 2 at the White House on defense issues, so I know a little bit about confidentiality, at least in that sense. But what I spend quite a bit of our time at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council on is trying to make sense of sort of the direction the world's going in, and then how do we get a better handle on navigating it. We had a big conference yesterday with David Brin and others on why we think we're in a new era of world history, but the historians haven't named it yet.
Mm-hmm. Barry runs an amazing conference once a year, the Strategic Foresight Conference. Barry and a small group are in that very small overlap between people who care about national security and people who know about technology. He's in a very small little sliver that overlaps. And so I'm going to start with you. Let's start with case studies. When I'm a professor at Georgetown, I teach a series of case studies. WikiLeaks is still an incredibly important case study. What did we learn from that? I mean, when I look at what happened, I see a whole bunch of information that got out that wasn't supposed to get out, but it turned out that much of that information has shaped policy. It's helped fuel the Arab Spring. It's led to maybe less corruption, or at least more awareness of corruption. There's a lot of things that good came out of that. So what do you think, Barry? Should we have 5 more WikiLeaks episodes this year?
I'll sort of give you, I think, a 3-part answer. Number one, I'm not sure all of it that came out has good effects necessarily. I do think the more information that's out, sort of the better. But number 2 is, there's probably a few crown jewels that if anyone who is listening to this right now would say, that's probably best that's the kind of information that probably shouldn't get in the hands of someone who has very bad intentions. So there's probably a small subset, and I would argue much smaller than the current national security apparatus, which had its origins almost 70 years ago now, in 1947. I would argue that that culture is exactly the opposite of actually what's needed now for their mission. And so my primary hypothesis when it comes to the part of our government that is focused on what they think is very valuable information, that is the intelligence community, in my view, was designed for an era when it was really hard to get information and much easier to analyze it. And now that it's the opposite, I think we are very misaligned with that part of what our taxpayer money pays for.
But you had a lot of colleagues at the Atlantic Council, a lot of former colleagues still within the Defense Department who look at WikiLeaks and draw exactly the opposite conclusion from what you and I conclude.
I've been telling them...
We conclude more information is better. They conclude, oh my God, we've got to lock it down.
Well, it does cause more work, and in some cases more, it doesn't help. But I've been trying to get them to focus on the Snowden after next.
Oh, that sounds like a good sequel.
Not even this one.
Okay.
In other words, they're chasing the headline when they should be looking at the broader trend and figuring out how to realign to deal better with this new world.
Okay, well, pass the microphone to Mark Rasch, who's going to tell us who you are, why you care about confidentiality.
Where I was for the last 15 minutes, which was at 1901 K Street.
Oh.
It got mistranslated into my calendar.
Oh, no.
By the way, you guys aren't there, so.
We have better food here, actually.
I think that's true. I'm Mark Rasch. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer for SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation. And in a previous life, I was a federal prosecutor, started the Justice Department Computer Crime Unit, which at the time I left the Justice Department consisted of me. So it made the staff meetings kind of interesting.
And there were about 4 criminals at the time.
There were 4, and we caught them all, and we solved the problem of computer crime, so I left.
You missed one.
I did miss one, and I know who it is. Right. On the Snowden issue, I was at a meeting with the head of counterintelligence for the FBI, and he took the FBI's position, which I've heard repeated in a lot of government agencies, that Snowden is and always was a spy, that Snowden's purpose and intent was to harm the national security of the United States, that Snowden, it's no coincidence that Snowden ended up in Russia. He intended all the time to turn over U.S. secrets to Russia and intended to harm the national security. And the problem with that is I can understand why they believe that, but the problem with that philosophy, and you dropped your cell phone right there. Hopefully it's a Microsoft cell phone. The problem with starting with that philosophy is it doesn't begin to understand the motivations of a Snowden. Not of Snowden, but of a Snowden. And when you're trying to deal with the problem of the insider threat, you have to understand what why an insider does what they do. And the other problem is we talk about whistleblower. A whistleblower is typically somebody who uncovers illegal conduct and decides that they want to report that illegal conduct. And Snowden doesn't fit within that either, because what he discovered was perfectly legal, or at least approved, conduct that he disagreed with. And not only did he disagree with it, but that he believed that the public had a right to know about. And so there's no mechanism for a non-whistleblower to express their beliefs and have them heard out. And if you treat him like a spy, you're going to be dealing with the wrong issue.
What about the Chelsea Manning case, though? That's the classic example that people point to when they say government could be more transparent. Well, look at all this useful information that the government was collecting, and could have been shared in some way. Instead,
what's interesting about the Chelsea Manning case is that if you look at the underlying documentation in the Snowden case and the Manning case, there's a huge difference between the two types of data. And I have a lot more sympathy, and I prosecuted espionage cases too. I have a lot more sympathy for, quite frankly, the Snowden disclosures, because those were policy matters. What Snowden disclosed was the fact that the government was conducting this type of surveillance, not who we were conducting it on. The fact that we collect data, that we believe we have a legal right to collect data on every American. The fact that we believe we have a legal right to infect computers, weaken encryption, and all that stuff. Those are kind of policy discussions that we should be having in any event. What Manning disclosed was more operational stuff.
Yeah.
And
some analysis, though. I mean, the State Department memos were exposing corruption. They were.
Manning didn't go through that kind of analysis. Manning did a core dump and said, here. But in Manning's defense, and again, I prosecuted espionage cases, he disclosed this information like Snowden did to a journalist and said, hey, journalist, go through the journalistic functions of deciding, what to publish, what not to publish. He didn't just do a core dump himself.
Yeah.
So that happened in both cases.
Okay, let's turn to a journalist, or former journalist. Allan, do you want to?
There's no such thing as a former journalist. It's like being an ex-Marine.
So are we going to see more WikiLeaks? Are we going to see, is transparency inevitable, or do you think the reaction to all of the Snowden cases and the exposure is going to be tighter controls?
I think it will continue. I just, covering...
No, he's got a microphone. We all have microphones.
It's really not coming through. So
it may not be turned off.
Maybe I didn't.
Did you turn it on? Yeah.
But anyway, knowing how poor security is practiced throughout government, and even probably a little bit better in the private sector, but it's not great. Look at Target. Yes, it's going to continue, and whether the leaks go to a journalist or not is up for debate. But yeah, I definitely believe that you're going to continue to see this. There's no 100% secure computer system.
Are journalists going to get better at pulling it out? I mean, this isn't just about technology. This is about more effective means of convincing people to open up.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the old skill set that journalists still have. There are fewer of them though. I mean the
bloggers don't count.
I'm sorry.
Bloggers don't count. People with smartphones.
Well, it depends on who the blogger is, but yeah, but I think overall there are fewer journalists. There are fewer people doing this, and that's why my organization at the Center for Public Integrity is probably seeing more interest in what we do, because there's fewer journalists at mainstream newspapers and news outlets that can do this because they just don't have the money anymore.
Okay.
But yes, I think you'll definitely see more.
Okay, so you can check your microphone there to see if it's okay. Greg, do you want to talk a little bit about the role that open data and more transparency in government
Sure.
could
Can
play?
I take a poll of the audience first?
Sure.
Can I?
You can do whatever you like. This is informal.
Or this is informal. So, everyone at home, you could tweet your answer to this since you can't raise your hands. So I want everyone to think of a number between 1 and 100. Just pick a number. Don't say what it is. Now, if that number is even, I want you to lie when you answer this next question. Okay? Raise your hand if you think that when we get a transparent society, you'll beat your wife and children or your spouse and your children less than you are today. Okay.
That's telling.
That was very informative. I wanted to, so I'm glad to see that most people are not going to change their habits of they're not going to beat their spouse and
an
children
anonymity poll. I've never seen that done so effectively. Yeah. So an anonymous survey in person. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So okay.
Frequency or duration?
I think you're getting, that was actually the point that I was after. It's really the subtleties of the way the question is phrased that can trip you up. I think that, it's, I have to admit that for myself, the larger inspiration has always been there's something magical about the openness of the internet. And that the internet itself has kind of said, you know what, if we peer with each other and we establish a very small set of protocols of how we interact, then there can be a lot of innovation that occurs. And so opening up data for me has been not so much getting new data available to the public, quite frankly, as it has been that taking data that has been mandated to be legally disclosed, information that has been out there for many years, and bringing it into the internet way of exchanging information, making it machine readable, making it accessible 24/7, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, that has been the larger driver, and it's a smaller driver around the questions of should more information be available today than was before? Because we have a tradition in America of disclosure. Mm-hmm. It goes all the way back to the Constitution.
Okay, Tom, are we winning? Is the transparency lobby winning?
I think we're making progress. And I would say that there shouldn't be any doubt about the efficacy of transparency and its importance. It's difficult to define counterfactuals, but we've got pretty good evidence that more transparent policies, more data release can lead to things like fewer corruptions for public corruption. When you look at the introduction of FOI laws across the states and do a timing analysis, political budget cycles where administrations invest more money in the economy right before an election, that diminishes in more transparent countries. There are real benefits here. What I would say, though, is that the role of
just to challenge that, I mean, you do have people saying that things are too transparent. You can't have a good time and be a congressman anymore. It's just the number of people who don't get into politics or don't take a public position is maybe related to the fact that you just can't
That there are more
be
women.
private.
That there are more women in politics now.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
I mean, what about Rob Ford? I mean,
That's true.
I mean, certainly, we may need to continue to shift our norms. I don't think that the way that we adapt to the level of information, the type of information that's disclosed, is necessarily caught up with what technology enables. But I'm not sure that any of us, could really imagine what life in a very small medieval town would be like, right? There's a different kind of panopticon. What technology is doing is multiplying the effect of mechanisms like whistleblowers, like disclosures, but I don't think it's changing the fundamental nature of those disclosures or the mechanisms by which they are effective. What I would point to, though, is that the way that those effects are distributed is also kind of obeying the way our society is normally organized, and it's quite problematic in a lot of ways. There is an embrace of technology and its capacity for enhancing transparency by the administration and other parties, but it's in some ways quite half-hearted. You can look at just the example of the IRS, for instance, where we've got a lot of data disclosed by them in the form of 990s about nonprofits. They are declining to enforce laws about how C4s are organized, gigantic amounts of...
And what are C4s for?
C4s are a nonprofit organization that's increasingly used by political entities to funnel money into our system. And basically because it's a charged environment, the IRS is declining to require disclosure of their donors or to require that they be reclassified as different entities.
And that's C as in Carl?
That's
Carl
right,
Rove.
C4s.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So look, we've got
5013CC.
Yeah. We've got no information about C4s. We have some information. We don't have the information we ought to have under the law. Information about C3s and other organizations that are politically active are disclosed as open data. They're TIFF files that you have to scan in an OCR. And Carl Malamud, a lone hero on the internet, is the only person who does this. Meanwhile,
He's the patron saint of openness.
That's right. Meanwhile, individual citizens' social security numbers are scattered throughout this database, and the IRS won't even take Carl's call. So, basically there's very little attention paid to how disclosure is affecting the little guy, and quite a bit of preservation of the big guy's power within the system.
Okay, so transparency is here, but it's not evenly distributed. Is that going to change?
Well, gradually, the unevenness isn't going to change, but if we are aggressive, it won't get worse. When I am after my fourth or fifth beer, feeling very political and depressed, I, would say that we're experiencing right now a deliberate reigniting of the American Civil War, because the main effect of the political paralysis that we have in this town is to destroy the ability of the Republic to solve problems. And if you look across the last 100 years, that ability has been prodigious. If you look at the reasons for optimism in the world, putting aside the Antarctic ice sheet and a number of other things, there are many, many positive trends in the world today. Overall, per capita decreases in violence, decreases in poverty, and a substantial trend over the next 30 years, if we can maintain a true international pax, that a general zeitgeist on the planet of openness and assumptions of individualism and tolerance and diversity. But if you were to read Putin's speech last week about how a new alliance is going to stand up to the bullying of the hegemony of diversity.
He used that phrase?
Yes.
That wasn't a mistranslation. Wow. It must. His poll ratings probably went up five more points after that one.
The notion that this decadent worldview must pass away in favor of traditional values. This is a guy who thinks the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy in history, and officially despises communism and visits the Russian Orthodox Church every week.
And thinks the internet was a CIA project.
This is, as we say, illogical. But the point is that when I consult with, putting aside the reignited Civil War, which we can talk about the reasons, And threats like that and the good news I described, the fundamental is whether or not this republic can return to being a society in which people negotiate with each other. In which
but some people say openness makes that harder. You can't do backroom deals. You know, everything's in the open. Everybody knows who's getting what, who wins and who loses. And
that's a very good provocative question. But in fact,
openness is knowledge.
But
The fact that information is out there doesn't mean it's simply processed or used.
If
We're essentially stupid people.
But no, but you see, this is, in my opinion, the reason for igniting the Civil War. As long as politics in America can be based upon visceral, emotional loyalties, then evidence plays no role. As a matter of fact, the evidentiary professions, the skilled professions of knowledge, all of them are on the enemy's list. I can name 3 exceptions, but I defy people online to name them, and they can't. So it's not just a war on science. I didn't mean to get all political on this, because when you get right down to it, I talk to, once or twice a year, I fly back east here, and I talk to defense and security and intelligence specialists. And I point out to them one fundamental across the next 50 years. And that is all the enemies, all the foes who want our destruction, as opposed to rivals, business rivals, and that sort of thing, which we can easily live with. All of them share one trait, and that is a fatal allergy to light.
Mm-hmm.
Criminals, Putin-esque countries,
North Korea,
the terrorist cells, all of them are lethally allergic to light, and I would include conspiratorial oligarchies are lethally allergic to light. Our system proves again and again that we find light sometimes irksome. And that is the net effect of Assange and Manning and Snowden, is that at worst it was irksome. Worse than that, the worst it gets is that it is occasionally lethal to leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But we make that distinction. And hence, because of that distinction, light tends to be bracing, it tends to be invigorating. Whatever Snowden's motives, and I quite agree that he was a complicated fellow and possibly even a double agent. Snowden represents a class of people I discussed in the Transparent Society called the social T cell, in which you have...
Like an immune system.
Yes. Egotistical bachelor males, male underachievers, who see an opportunity to become a hero. And in an act of preening, do more than the evidence suggests, the degree of heinousness of what they revealed. As a matter of fact, I think Hillary Clinton gave a secret medal to Assange, because if you look at the cause and effect relationship of those 250,000 State Department memos, there were a few embarrassing things, and there were a couple of hundred cables of US State Department officials discreetly and confidentially despising Mubarak, despising the dictators they had to work with.
Well, the Iranians had a press conference to denounce the whole thing as a fraud because it was exposing the U.S. as being on the right side of issues.
Exactly, and so the net result was no American flags being burned.
Okay, let's go global for a minute. I'm going to turn to the audience here very quick for questions, but one global question. This week we've seen the headlines about the right to be forgotten. The fact that the European Union Court of Justice has decided that Google cannot link to personal information and news reports, public information. This is public information that's on the web. Google is being told that they can be requested and required to not link to a particular piece of information. So this is totally the opposite of transparency. It's an old idea. People want to have some zone of privacy, and now they're going to court in Europe to get this. Does anybody think this is a good idea, and does anybody think it's going to actually happen?
I think it's a good idea.
Which part of it? The right to be forgotten?
The right to be forgotten. Okay. Does it wrong? I think it's a good idea, the right to be forgotten, for certain information, and I think completely impractical the way it was implemented, and probably unfair the way it was implemented. Unfair to Google. Yes, unfair to Google. First of all, we have to differentiate between different types of information. There's a whole bunch of information that is collected that is intended to be ephemeral and have only a temporary lifespan. And something like that, like traffic information, as you drive on the beltway, there's a legitimate reason to collect it, but no legitimate reason to retain it.
Well, I might want it retained. I mean,
You might.
If in 3 years I'm accused of murder and I can prove that with this data I was in
And my
another
answer to
county,
you is, tough luck. I would have said a different word, but yeah, I mean, the point about it is it's intended to be ephemeral.
Right.
And even though there are some societal advantages to retaining the data, okay, it's intended to be ephemeral. That's the kind of stuff that you should have a right to have forgotten. That's one. The second, and this is really tough from a criminal law standpoint, is if you get arrested for DUI in Massachusetts, the fact that you got arrested goes on a police blotter. And in the old days, in 1960, if you got arrested for DUI and then it was dismissed and you got it expunged, it was literally gone. Now, the fact that it's been the arrest is now reproduced on dozens of web pages. Immediately after the arrest, you start getting letters from damn criminal lawyers saying, you know, would you like me? And it persists, and it persists forever. So there's a lot of information that should not persist. The problem is, we can't decide which information should persist and which one shouldn't. So the right to be forgotten, the right to have ephemeral information exist only for an ephemeral period of time is a good thing, okay? But it's a very difficult thing to decide.
there is a California state law that says that children, minors, have a right to be forgotten, and that they should have the ability to make sure.
I think I have kids. I don't recall.
The idea was that if you posted something on Facebook when you were 13, you should have the ability to make sure that never appears again. But even there, if somebody else copies it and puts it on their own blog,
well,
and makes
as Ben
fun of you-
Franklin said, two people can keep a secret provided one of them is dead.
Yeah.
I'll
Okay,
just,
Tom.
Because I wanted to key off of that.
You're going to tell him he's right or wrong?
No, I mean, I think that he is right in a lot of respects. The specific EU proposal is getting pretty harsh reaction, including years before from some technical bodies within the EU who declared it unworkable. And there are others that predate it. I think Victor Meyer-Schonberger has had a bunch of proposals around metadata and automatic expiration of content. I think technologists tend to think they're unworkable, but practically they are doable when you have a concentrated player in the marketplace. This example is closely related to the mugshot sites the New York Times wrote about last year. That article basically single-handedly ended that horrible, horrible little industry because it got Google to take notice and deprioritize them in their search results. So it ceased to be a lucrative business to collect mugshots from sheriff's websites and charge people to take them down. Now, that information is still in the public domain, and it's still, you know, someone could create a separate web crawler, but just the facts of how we navigate the web between Google and Bing and a few other big players who are capable of indexing this amount of information makes it feasible to have an impact because of those concentration points.
Other comments on the?
Yeah, I guess I'll make a comment here because I think that there's perhaps a useful distinction that people have not talked about. Well, let me rephrase that. There's a useful distinction that needs a more explicit airing than has gotten to date. And that distinction is between public and very public. Mm-hmm. And we at the FCC encountered this issue, have encountered this issue a few times. And with the project that I worked on, which was the public inspection file, were documents that TV stations had been making publicly available for 70 years. The commission decided we're now going to be available online in a database,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the problem is if you want to go around...
Just the new ones or the entire history?
It's basically the new ones, the current ones moving forward, because there was already rules in place that essentially had to do with you only have to keep the ones that pertain to the current license you have, mm-hmm. or current things that are being adjudicated or in court or something like that. So there was already a schedule, mm-hmm. Documented schedule. And in fact, sidebar really quick, all information management in the federal government has a schedule. That is, I am allowed to destroy certain information after a certain period of time, and I may even be required to destroy it after a certain period of time. You only have to, personal, you only have to keep your tax records so many years. But in government, it's the same thing. After so much time, I either destroy it or I give it to the archives. But everything is supposed to have a schedule. So information was available that had to do with the price of political advertisements. Because it's very necessary for democracy that I can buy equal time at the same price that Tom is buying time during a campaign. So that's only appropriate.
Right.
But I think that an issue that came up there, and this is not unique, is that suddenly information that was public was now going to be very easy for people to find regarding the pricing of the advertisements. And that concerned the television stations greatly. And if you read the letter of the law, there is no distinction in our current laws between public and public online.
Right.
And it's very easy for Sunlight Foundation and for pro-open advocacy people to say, look, we want this, if it's public, I just want to get it on the web because A, that's how I get it. B, it's more convenient. I can't drive around to all these TV stations or all these different polling places. I want to have this information online. And it's supposed to be public anyway, so why would you make that distinction? But at the same time, there is a difference between something being available in the library or something being available somewhere and something being available in a way that you can easily find it and aggregate it.
Who was the judge who said pragmatic obscurity? It was a justice from the last round of Supreme Court justices. And I consider that to be an incredibly foolish distinction, although something similar is not foolish.
Let me ask you this really quickly. Okay, great. So I'm not, in making the distinction, I'm not saying what we should do with the two. I'm just saying that maybe we should explicitly talk about that distinction because we haven't been explicitly talking about it. And if you've got an alternative, please.
Well, yes, because it has to do with the sliding scale of accountability. The mighty need more accountability than average people, and especially than our children. This is already enshrined both in common law and in regular law. Some of you out there, if your particulars are posted online, you have a right to sue for violation of privacy. I don't. I'm a public figure. I would have to show damages. The fact of the matter is that there's already a sliding scale here, and if you're talking about what the Europeans want to achieve with this on a pragmatic basis, enabling children who do something embarrassing to say, don't link to this. On a pragmatic basis of 5 years, I think the Europeans are ahead of us. Psychologically, I think they are out of their ever-loving gourds because they actually think that they can control the flow of information over time.
So does Mr. Putin.
Yes.
So do the Chinese.
And it is in our interest to make sure that the world sees and this is what I tell the people in the CIA and all these people. What's convenient for you is not important. What's needed is a secular trend toward a more open world, because in that world, villains will not thrive, and our general way of life will. Now, our children are already on Facebook voting by their postings. They're both voting and vesting faith in a future in which people will be forgiven for non-heinous, non-deliberately harmful, embarrassing things. They are already declaring their fealty to such a world by investing a need for it.
But if you're the owner of the LA Clippers,
then he's being held accountable. He's a public figure.
Well, but in that case, it's not public information or very public information. It's very private information. It's a conversation and we're seeing this.
As a people, we need to get used to this notion that whatever anybody is caught saying by somebody who spied on them in a private conversation, it should be cut in half. I think that's a fair.
That's a good factor?
Rule of thumb.
Okay, I got a question.
Everyone is caught in, sorry?
In his case, it being caught in half merely wants me to throttle him. Still pretty bad. Still pretty bad.
Interesting discussion. My name is Lee Marie Thompson. I'm with the ISOC-DC chapter. And to stir up a little bit even further the conversation, do you think individuals in a respected sovereign state have the right to lobby their governments to determine how they want the internet rules to be when it comes to keeping secrets or not keeping secrets? What are the rights for those that are not in the U.S. and respected countries that they want to lobby their governments to make decisions like what was done in the Europe?
So anybody who wants to take on the global trends.
The balkanization of the internet, right?
Okay.
Well, all right. So I think each country has its own values, mores, and laws that reflect those. And as a society and as a culture, they can value privacy more or less in another country. They can value openness more or less. They can value corporate entitlement more or less in another country. And they can try to, and you can certainly lobby the legislature, you know, of one country to try to impose rules. Ultimately, it's doomed to failure because of the nature of the internet itself, and we see this over and over again when we try to regulate content on the internet or display of content. So what they might be able to do is regulate collection of information, okay, about individuals, or use of information about individuals by companies within that nation. But the nature of the internet is such that we see this in the UK. They have an Official Secrets Act, so you can't publish certain information in the UK. Well, you simply publish it on a website in the Isle of Man, and you're done.
So we have Tabloid Island, and the
Tabloid Island.
same sort of trend we saw with pirated software and pirated music. We're going to have.
Yeah, I mean, except for Microsoft. Nobody pirates Microsoft.
Nobody. You're right. They should never do that.
There will be alternatives to the internet, mesh interface networks of your cell phones, and we're going to need this for national security. Besides which, there's the Moore's law of cameras. Somebody called it Brin's corollary once. That the number of cameras is increasing, their number, diversity, range, acuity, mobility, every year faster than Moore's law. In such a world, especially as we also are developing whistleblowers and things like that, it's best if you try to develop your legal structures so that they are working with such trends. So they're working with the fact that you will have new leaks every year, and those who promise that there won't be another Target or another Heartbleed are idiots. Whereas you hope that the pragmatic improvements of security continue, but always in the moving with the flow of the tsunami, so that we can steer, so we can surf. If you try to run against the tsunami, which is the European policy, it's not going to work. It's just going to create illusions.
I just want to riff off of one quick thing about the cameras. So I was talking to somebody about license plate recognition software and how, you know, we need to regulate and control police use of license plate recognition software. And he pointed out that with everybody having a camera in your pocket, there's nothing to stop us from crowdsourcing exactly the same thing, and ultimately we'll be there at the end of the day. So whatever regulation you put on the police about that, you have to remember that you're going to have it all crowdsourced 3 years afterwards, and all the regulations will be useless.
Okay, Barry, you're only here for another 10 minutes, and I want to get the international perspective. I mean, do we see countries going in different directions here? Do we see countries embracing transparency at the same time other ones are trying to lock it all down?
We don't. I mean, I guess that I'd make sort of one here and now point and one 2020 point. The here and now point is my heart says I'm with David Brin, and this is all for the good. My worry is that more authoritarian governments who, as the Obama administration says, are still using 20th century tactics, even though I actually think they're 21st century tactics. My worry is, I mean, there's a race between the individual and the state. Mm-hmm. As the communications revolution continues and as the next 6 revolutions come on top of that. And I am an optimist that the race will be won by the people. But I still have some significant residual worries that some of these countries with different cultures and with different polities and different government experiences are not might not get the memo.
So you don't reject Yevgeny Morozov's thesis that the bad guys could exploit all this openness of...
I think we're seeing it. I don't think they'll win. I think it's unstoppable, but I worry about how quickly we get there. The 2020 question I wanted to pose was, does any of our discussion change when, for example, 3D printed files get thrown across the internet of biological weapons or something worse? And I've had discussions with government officials within the last month about very, very related questions.
Well, lawyers will tell you that bad cases make interesting law, and that's a really bad case. I think, Tom, did somebody want to pick up on 3D printers?
Well, I'm always happy to talk about 3D
Okay,
printers.
go ahead.
But actually, I mean, just to take a step back, I worry that this conversation seems strange to say it here, but it's kind of suffering from an engineering mindset, I think, in that, yes,
we've got a lawyer over there.
I mean, everybody's absolutely right that, a lot of things technology is making possible are inevitable. Yes, you cannot fight against the feasibility of license plate scanning without some incomprehensibly repressive regime to restrict the flow of technology. And yes, the EU restriction will not be perfect and won't prevent people from being able to assemble this kind of knowledge. But I guess the point I would make is that this is really a kind of binary way of looking at things. It ignores the fact that access to information exists in an economic equilibrium. There are costs associated with collecting, organizing, retaining, searching, and even deleting information. And policy can shift all of those costs to make these activities more or less likely. It's a little bit uncomfortable to think that whether or not an intemperate tweet I sent 2 years ago could be the thing that gets me hounded out of a job 5 years from now in a probabilistic way, instead of getting a guarantee that this is how our society operates or isn't. But that's just the way that it works, I think. And we can collectively try to shift those probabilities, but I don't know that we're going to arrive at guarantees.
Well, this is what Greg was saying when he was talking about open and more open, or what was it again?
Open versus very open.
Yes, and I was actually going to say that I agree with this on a different level, and that is when you talk about that sliding scale.
It's public versus, I'm sorry, it's public.
Public versus very public.
You talk about that sliding scale, and when you're dealing with the average person being extorted by a mugshot site, I am perfectly in favor of something that you were hinting at, I believe, or it's what I got from what you were saying, and that there be an economic disincentive for that to be the first thing that comes up. That the embarrassing things that are really what we would call nobody's business, but in the age of the village, the returning village, can be everybody's business, but you have to actually prove yourself to be a bit nosy to find them, or pay 25 cents, or pay $1. I'm perfectly willing to negotiate those sliding scales, but the point is to expect that to be the world. Look, you're going to be walking down the street. It ain't just the
Google Glass.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just the license plates. It's the face registries, which are currently banned, but they're coming back. They're coming anyway, and you are going to see name tags under everybody walking by. You'll never be at a loss for words. You'll see the first three sentences of their profile, or click your tooth and scroll, and you'll get the 3 sentences of dissenting opinions from their ex-spouses.
Except for the brilliant new invention, the super realistic mask.
Oh,
there's a company that's selling these.
Yes,
it's brilliant. The first one they made was a very realistic mask of the CEO of the company.
Oh my God, Elvis is going to be everywhere.
You have 20 choices now.
I have this in my novels, Existence and in Killing People, and
But they're really realistic.
It'll
I mean,
work
you can't
for
tell.
6 months.
You can't tell. You can't tell.
Yes, but then people will be tracking camera back until they see a guy entering a men's room with a paper bag.
Okay. You're too smart. Okay, questions. Okay, make it controversial. We don't have enough yelling yet. Okay.
We can always talk about Beyonce and Jay-Z and Solange if you like. I wanted to ask you about the legal side, and this is probably again for you, how laws will change as far as privacy. Do you anticipate in general that laws will change about what's considered the appropriate use of a camera, especially if we get into the microchips where you can actually start filming people without them knowing?
The answer is that laws are going to change, but they're going to not necessarily in the way you think they are. Initially, the reaction to any new technology is to say, that's horrible, it needs to be banned. Then it gets accepted. Then it gets regulated. Then it gets even more accepted, and it becomes part of normal life. So if you look at the like facial recognition, first we're scared of it. I'm scared of it. I don't think it's anybody's business to be able to put in my name into a database and find out every place that I've been forever. Okay? And so we're going to regulate. We're going to say this is the appropriate use and the inappropriate uses of it. Then we're going to start realizing, as David pointed out, that there's a lot of really good things that can happen with facial recognition. You never have to be at that party awkwardly saying, oh yeah, hi, how are you? Because it'll say right in your Google Glass, hello, my name is Inigo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die, right? And so suddenly we'll discover some greater utility to it. And it'll start being adapted. And then really it has to be inculcated into culture. Because if it's not inculcated into culture, if you have a conflict between law and culture, culture is going to win over law. And you end up with a repressive society.
Okay, Allan?
Yeah, I just want to follow that on what David said, is that our culture isn't static, it's fluid. And you can think of so many examples of where in the 20th century where something came out and they said, oh my God, this is the worst thing. Even our sexual
ads in movies.
Yeah, there you go. But, it has to do with sexual mores. It has to do with almost anything, people not wearing ties to work. I mean, it's even that mundane, but things, except in Washington.
Did you not talk about me?
Yeah, oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So I think as the younger generation, I have 3 teenage boys who I can't believe what they put on their Facebook and tweet when they occasionally let me see it. Although the male brain doesn't stop maturing until they're 25, so I think that has something to do with it. But
it doesn't start maturing. Because I have 2 teenage kids.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. The culture is gonna catch up, and so something that I find appalling is something that even my nieces who are in their 20s and 30s that they think I'm crazy. So,
right. So what happens is law follows technology. It lags, then it locks itself in, and it stays there as technology keeps moving. So originally, well, we need a law to deal with this problem. It lags behind technology. Technology creates a legal problem. The law is passed, and then it stays static as technology bypasses it.
I think one of the most important things is trust. And right now, partly because we're in my opinion, a civil war, possibly deliberately instigated, we cannot trust each other enough to negotiate. And negotiation is what adults do. And we could negotiate pragmatic short-term 5-year...
You're not from this town, are you?
Pragmatic short-term 5-year solutions. And we're all across the country praying, that well, I don't know, we have Jerry Brown there, so we maybe we're sappy. The point is that in the 5-year term, the 15-year term, and over the long run, accepting that we're going to live in a more open world. When our friend Peter Swire was part of the Presidential Commission,
today.
Yeah, and they came up with the NSA proposals. Half of them were sort of Potemkin, pat us on the head. These are new procedures. Maybe a small fraction of them were what we really need, and this is what I talk about in the Transparent Society, is aggressively looking back, which is what you guys are up to. Most of you guys in this row, God bless you, you're in the business of surveillance, turning the light back. And when people say, we can't do that because the mighty are mighty, and if there's open transparency, they'll have advantages, we have this new innovation of the non-governmental organization, in which masses of people can then allow you to hire top people on our behalf. And it's a brilliant addition to the Enlightenment. And it may be one of the reasons we can handle it.
But there are entire businesses, entire industries that are reliant upon the fact that you can keep secrets. So whether it's a law firm or a auto dealership that doesn't want you to know how much they paid for the car, or many news organizations, the ones that charge a lot of money, make their money because they give a certain select class that's wealthy enough to buy their service
I got
a little
nothing
head
against
start.
Tactical secrecy and personal privacy. But the way that we're going to be able to keep them is by having it be, as you were saying, selected segmentations, declared zones.
Mm-hmm.
And that within those zones, like the curtilage it's called, around your own home and your bedroom.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have privacy when people can make money by having privacy.
And is that a prediction that somebody will do that?
No, it's just, it's a prediction that's when people can make money by protecting privacy or by encouraging privacy, we will have privacy.
A bunch of companies have tried to do that.
No,
and
we
most
can,
of
we
them
can
have
make
gone
a
out of
lot
business.
more money by destroying privacy.
Yeah.
And so
Well, Microsoft is trying to do that right now by offering a little bit more privacy than our competitors.
but
and it's very hard to show people that we actually are offering that
but
privacy.
offering privacy and allowing people to choose between private and not private isn't what I mean. What I mean is when privacy itself makes you money, all right, as opposed to openness.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, there's a market for data. Data can be sold for advertising and marketing and all kinds of stuff. All right, so data has value. Not having data doesn't have value, and it's a cost. So, for example, one of the questions I wrote in a brief in one of these the Clipper chip cases. Okay, and the question was about encryption or non-encryption. If we could have a society where everything was encrypted, or a society where nothing was encrypted, those are the two choices. Which one is the safer society?
I would argue the encrypted world, but I'm strange.
And I wrote a whole book about that.
Yes, you did. What's your?
I don't have an answer. I have a question.
Okay. Yeah. Does anybody have an answer to that question? Okay.
I think if you're going to go all whole hog in one direction or another, it should be an open world. And here's the reason. That privacy is not enshrined in the Constitution. There are a couple of places where it's implicit. But it's very clear that privacy, as Jefferson said, privacy and property are contingent rights that each generation can redefine. A primary right is a right that has to be defended absolutely, because any entailment of it, any reduction of it, reduces our children's chances to change their minds about what was agreed by the previous generation about the contingent rights. And therefore, freedom to know and freedom to speak have to be absolute, because they cannot be diluted. So our children pass a law that everyone has to go around naked. You don't like that. So you stand on a street corner naked with the right to hold a sign saying, I want clothes back, and to argue with them and buttonhole them and grab their non-existent lapel. And you can persuade them to change their minds. That's why to know and to speak are fundamental rights. And if you have those rights, if you are a powerful, sovereign, militant, powerful, middle-class citizenry, then you will vote yourself some privacy. You'll find a way to have some privacy because it's what we want. Okay.
Question over here?
It's hard to follow that, but maybe the pursuit of happiness is relevant here. It struck me that privacy was sort of viewed as a very individual, we the consumers, the little people, and then there was sort of a shift when Google and everybody found out that their fibers were being spied on and that everybody, that their business materials were being taken. Do you see any alliance between the big guys and the small guys? Because there's a lot of vulnerability of the moneyed forces to exposure as well.
So who's going to have more confidentiality, the big guys or the little guys?
Sicking big guys against each other was always one of the fundamental techniques of the Enlightenment, preventing them from forming collusion and finding some big guys to sick against other big guys. That's why it's such a big agenda item to capture the federal government.
And the definition of privacy between the big guys and the little guys are completely different. What they consider to be privacy and what the little guys consider to be privacy are completely different things. The other thing is...
Can you give an example? What do you mean?
Sure. I mean, when you talk about individual privacy, you're talking about... There are various concepts of privacy. There's the right to be left alone.
I think we're talking here about confidentiality.
The confidentiality
small firms
of
versus
data.
big firms.
Well, but I thought the individual against the company.
Did I? Oh, the full spectrum, okay.
So the problem you have with the individual confidentiality is the concept of ownership of data. Who owns the data about you? If I pick up the phone and I make a phone call, there's a record of that phone call kept by AT&T. Under current law, those are not my records. While I have some privacy interests in them, they're very small. Those are the phone company's records of how I use their services. And so the vast majority of data about me is not mine. I don't have an ownership interest, and I only have a tangential privacy interest that the law recognizes. And I'm deliberately saying that the law recognizes. Whereas when corporations create data, they own that data for the most part. And so there's a difference in terms of how they control privacy.
Mark, what about a tangible interest rather than controlling your?
That's exactly what we need to do.
Information, but having a right to be paid.
Well, not just to be paid, but more than that. The idea should be that people have privacy interests, not necessarily a right, but privacy interests in data collected about them.
I think that I would go further and say that we need a way of expressing shared ownership of intellectual property that we don't currently have in today's law, especially intellectual property that's data.
Like what?
So
what do you mean? What kind of intellectual property?
So my pet peeve is that I actually have to pay to get my credit rating.
Right.
That and to me that is uncivilized.
Right.
You know, if there's an organization that is going to derive profit off of having data of my transactions, then I have at least an ownership interest, not merely privacy, but an ownership interest in that data that entitles me to access to it and use it in the same way that my medical records, I have a shared interest in it. My interests are not exclusive to the doctor's interests because they are creating, the hospital and the doctor is co-generating that record with me. And I think but we have zero intellectual property framework right now for that type of recognized authorship of a data generator. And what we get really is law, as you pointed out, for people who are collecting the data in the first place, right, or creating them, or ending up with the metadata. And I think that, but the problem is so to answer your question, I would say, meh. You know, we may see places where there is an alignment between what citizenry are interested in and what public is, what certain large corporations want. There's an alignment. We may even see that there's suddenly a deep partnership on something. But I think that in general, for the foreseeable future, there is such a disparity between the amount of money that people are making off of aggregating data and the ability to share interest in that data with individuals and the lack of a legal framework for it, that the possibility of actual deep collaboration.
It's even worse if your name is Mike Nelson. You not only have to pay to get your credit report, you then have to spend a bunch of time fixing it because the other Mike Nelsons have done something that you got blamed for. Okay, question back here. Can everybody identify yourself too?
Lynn Wheeler, this is more pontificating. I wrote a bunch of the financial standards, both for security and the co-author of the financial privacy standard. For the privacy standard, I had to meet with a bunch of government privacy officers to capture the institutional knowledge about those institution privacy. But from the security standards, a lot of the agency people would show up, and my comment is that 10 plus years ago, a Snowden event would not have been possible because of processes in place that would have prevented that sort of system in attack. The past 10 years have gotten worse. But I then got...
Or better.
Depend on what you look at. But then I got on sort of the opposite end of the financial industry when I was brought in to California to help with the electronic signature law, the data breach notification law, and the opt-in privacy sharing law. Now, we got out electronic signature. We barely got out data breach because Congress was trying to preempt it to eliminate all requirements. The issue is that institutions do security to protect themselves. Data breaches, the institution isn't at risk, it's the individual. And so they had no motivation to do anything about data breaches. But in the opt-in privacy sharing, they managed at the last moment to get a preemption amendment to GLBA for opt-out. Graham-Leach-Bliley, which is now better known for repeal Glass-Steagall enabling too big to fail. But at the time, the rhetoric on the floor of Congress was the primary purpose of GLBA was to eliminate new entries into the banks, financial industry, so that you wouldn't have Microsoft, which was named on the floor of Congress, competing with the banks because Microsoft had better technology. But what wound up happening was that they got an amendment for opt-out that said they could share your privacy information, your personal information, unless you objected to it. And that if they didn't have a record of you objecting, they could share it. So the middle of the last, about 6-7 years ago, we went, there was a group that went to the FTC that showed that none of the institutions that were required to maintain opt-out privacy were actually maintaining any records whatsoever. That even the very weak opt-out sharing wasn't being enforced by the FTC, and the FTC constantly ignored it, foray after foray. Whereas California actually got very close to doing opt-in along with, at the same time of doing data breach, which said that your information by institutions would not be allowed to be shared unless you specifically agreed to it and that they had a record proving it.
That's about 5 interesting questions embedded in there, but let me pick up one thing you said. You were talking about the data breach legislation in California, and I think that's a brilliant example of where government-enforced transparency puts pressure on companies to do the right thing with regard to cybersecurity.
And I want to
so I want to challenge the panel. Are there other places where we should have government-enforced transparency for the good of the digital economy? Things that we could do that would make e-commerce work better, e-government work better?
Well, we tried to do it in the SEC arena, where we tried to make companies disclose the state of their cybersecurity. And the problem with that is, if you disclose our cybersecurity sucks, you basically make yourself a target. Mm-hmm. And if you disclose the normal pablum that they put into SEC disclosures, which is, you know, we are always at risk of attack, but we have comprehensive measures designed to deal with it poorly, it becomes meaningless. So sometimes transparency actually becomes a bad thing. If you had to tell everybody every vulnerability you had, tell the hackers that, it would be a bad thing. Of course, only for a brief period of time, because then you'd have to get much more secure much faster.
Well, there was that classic case about 15 years ago where the EPA decided they didn't want to disclose where all the toxic chemicals were. It was back in the 80s and 90s, it was considered a good thing that neighborhoods
Well, we have this debate on 0 days. You know, do we disclose 0 days before we have a patch?
Yep. Okay. Allan, did you have a comment on what government should force us to be more transparent about?
Actually, the toxic release inventory was a good example. I wasn't thinking of it. I was just thinking in the whole field, this is Sunlight is involved as well. Just, you know, who's giving what to whom. And
campaign contributions.
Campaign contributions.
Yes, but a certain gentleman who was CEO of Mozilla got caught up because of some money he gave, 8-9 years ago, to oppose a gay rights initiative in California. So
again, he probably wishes that had been forgotten. Sure, it's important to recognize, and I'm sorry to jump in, I'll go ahead, back please. Over, but I mean, there's an idea that I think flows from the secret ballot, which is designed to prevent the buying of votes. That is incorrectly extended to this idea that you should be able to participate anonymously and without consequences in our political discourse. And it's just wrong. If you're going to inject money into our politics, you should be accountable for that. People should be aware of the position that you're trying to shift the system toward. That just is a baseline.
Which means also piercing corporate
I would
Well,
change,
that's very true. Yeah.
I would alter. I'm going to phrase what you did slightly differently. I'll take responsibility for it. If you are spending money to advocate for something, you don't. The interesting question is do you necessarily get to say that you're not an advocate later on, right? Can you advocate with one hand and deny being an advocate on the other hand? And I think that and at what point is there a scale? Because I think the money is really a form of advocacy. Like I'm going to put this message out there, but I'm going to not acknowledge that it's me putting that message out there. And you can easily draw up a scenario, which is, on one hand, I don't want people to know that I'm fighting X, but the other hand, it's like I don't want people to know that I'm actually doing this other thing that I'd like. I'm actually, I'm taking marijuana for my cancer, and I don't want other people to know that while I'm spending money doing this. So it really comes down to it. I know that I'm sounding very confused. I think that we are struggling with how to talk about these issues. And so thank you for bringing us together and people coming today, because we need to learn how to talk about it. It's interesting that the individual at Mozilla, it only became an issue when he became the CEO.
Sure. Yeah.
So so I think it comes back to this notion of sliding scales. Suddenly, when he was the CEO, and I think it was also that some people raised it and maybe how it was handled. And likewise, if we take Sterling is really interesting because once this story went viral about his conversation, which was a confidential conversation that was leaked, and part of its power was the fact that it was a confidential, it was perceived.
It was the truth.
It was
how he really thought.
Right, because
actually, I don't even think it was. I think it was an unguarded moment, but I don't think that it is really the truth of how he really thought. I think it was an unguarded conversation. No, and by the way, his views on race are not nearly as bad as his views on women.
No, but I think the point is that the power. The interesting thing is that there is a trail of all sorts of right. There's this interesting trail. This was not out of character. It was not out of character, and there was a trail. There was multiple court cases,
and people knew about it, but no one cared until.
And then suddenly, this unguarded conversation, which I would say, yes, it's unguarded, but it's because it was perceived as happening in this envelope of confidentiality, which is not unlike the 53% comment. Mm-hmm. Right?
Mr.
That
Romney.
Has a different type of power or the cling to guns and Bible, because it's perceived to be wrapped in this envelope, the cone of silence.
How he really thinks.
You were talking about the free speech aspect of political donations, especially.
Yeah.
And in that case, the question is there a linear correlation with standing on the street corner and avowing your beliefs? And I think there is. Now, there always has to be some protection to shy people and a fundamental right to be able to do some political activity secretly. But there's your sliding scale again. If you're trying to have nonlinear effects, and you have the power of nonlinear effects, that's the same thing as the public figure thing that I was talking about before.
Yeah,
okay,
I would just say that it goes back to what you were saying. If you're involved in activities that affect the public, that if you're giving money, even if you're shy, I'm sorry, I want to know who you are and what your motives are, because what you're doing is creating a policy that's going to affect me, my family, my friends, my neighborhood. I think that's almost inviolate. That you gotta, if you're going to affect public policy, you got to stand up and say it's me, and this is what I'm.
Okay,
that's exactly right.
We've got another question.
Partly because our systems are really fragile. There's some really discouraging recent research from Brendan Nyhan and other people about how we process misinformation. Basically, like if you hear a lie about somebody and then that lie is corrected, your impression of them remains lower than it originally was. So at the very least, we can enforce norms around conversation that say, like, look, if you want to express your opinion, that is your right, and you can spend money to do it, but you're not going to be able to just hide behind anonymity to express something that's more than what you're prepared to stand
I think that fundamentally gossip is one of the deepest and most profound of all cultural problems, and it's going to not going to be dealt with by this generation. it's going to be dealt with by our much better kids. We've been bad-mouthing our teenagers all evening, and you know that fundamentally they're better people.
Shh. Don't let them hear that.
Yeah,
but I mean, one thing I want to point out about anonymous political speech is, we have a long tradition in this country, Publius on forward, of anonymous political speech. And in the McIntyre case, the Supreme Court said there is a constitutional right to anonymous political speech. So we have this, we have this balance between wanting openness and wanting to know what contributions have been given and wanting people to be able to speak anonymously.
Well, it's a little bit like the case with Google in Europe, where you have the right to say something, you don't have the right to amplify it.
Well, and you don't have the right to say something without consequence.
Right. Okay, so great. I have two questions left here, so let's get the last comments here.
I think that you brought up a great point earlier on in terms of the dichotomy between the 20th or 19th century, a world in which getting information was hard and analysis was easy, and that we've shifted to this world where information is easy and analysis is hard. And that information is easy. And that is at the heart of a lot of the real issues that are coming up, is that our Constitution and a lot of our legal framework is based on a moment in time where information technology was at a certain cusp of change, which had to do with the printing press and other things. And it's really scary to stand up and say, good for them, we live in a different world, let's change all of our institutions.
But you mentioned the decline of journalism, and it's of great...
I didn't.
No, yeah,
Allan
sorry.
did.
It's of great significance, and it's correlated with what you just said, in that at the same time that journalism is one of the named enemy elites, it is also declining economically. And I think I know how to help with the latter, and that is, it's very clear that what's desperately needed, and a potential billion-dollar business, is a system of micropayments.
Oh, damn.
And I think I know the secret sauce
That's another
for
session.
it, because quite frankly, it's bizarre that it hasn't been leaped upon. There are ways to do this that would really work.
Okay, we will do that. We actually did a panel about 3 years ago at Georgetown on Digital Media 2020. It was one of the most fascinating sessions we had. Okay, we have 2 questions over here, and so I'm going to do the lightning round. We have about 10 minutes left, so quick questions and quick, funny answers.
Okay, I'll try to do that. I'm Mike Sherling. I'm a graduating law student at George Washington University, and I'm maybe going to take this a little bit off track from the political speech that we were talking about, but before I get there, I just want to say that I don't appreciate the disparaging comments against women that some members of the panel have stated, and I think that this panel would...
No, we're referring to Mr. Sterling's comments.
No, this was before...
I think it was about beating.
That was one of them, and then someone mentioned that Congress, more women in Congress. Anyway, we don't have to get into it, but I think this panel would benefit from more racial and gender diversity.
We did invite a number of women.
Okay.
The first 3 people invited were all women.
Okay. No, that's great. I just wanted to comment on that. So, but back to this discussion, I think that I think that the panelists had 2 minds on the benefits and the just great pace of technology, but in order to enable all sorts of things, but yet skepticism about some government regulation requiring expiration of data or requiring controlling data in a certain way. And it seems like if we can keep expanding these cameras and all every sort of technology, we can also implement some database restrictions and some anonymization, aggregate data collection that really does make us more anonymous a few years after the data is collected. And I guess I'd like to for you guys to talk a little bit about that, and then what about the idea of making companies let people know how much their data is worth? So giving them an itemized list of where their data is going, how much it's worth, and choosing to not share that.
Sure.
Tough questions.
I'd be happy to take a stab at some of it. First, I would like to acknowledge that I think you're right that we would benefit from a diverse set of voices. I do think you may have misunderstood the comment about the representation of women in legislatures, which I took to be saying that transparency leads to greater representation, which was positive. In any event, the larger point, though, about using anonymization technologies and about trying to set a market price for data that's collected. There's some promise to both, but I think that both are complicated. How's that for a panel answer, right? I've written recently about the potential for using hashing and other cryptographic techniques to anonymize identifiers between individual records, and I think this is a technique the government could be using a lot more to allow for large-scale analysis without giving away personally identifiable information. But it is true that there's two things working against effective anonymization of data. One is the mosaic effect, which I suspect most people are familiar with. As data accretes from different sources, it becomes easier and easier to reach that threshold of bits of information where you can get down to an individual. Actually, the EFF has a really fascinating online tool where you can see how many bits of information your browser headers are emitting to figure out just how unique you are on the internet. Secondarily, there's a cost to trying to maintain systems that forget. It's a lot easier to stick data someplace and then, with the falling cost of media, continue to update it. And then finally, I would say, on the cost front, we are living in a really weird moment, right, where most of the services that we use are propped up by very speculative investor money that's designed to race them across the finish line to a giant network effect where they have dominance of a market and everybody else is going to make no money at all. So what's the value of the data that, for instance, I've got a pedometer app that was sending my location everywhere to a company called Moves. It's a really nice little visualization, and I think that complete panopticon style view of my movements was worth about zero to them, but now they just got bought by Facebook and gave me new terms of service, and the market value of that data has probably changed quite a bit given Facebook's relationships. So I don't know that it's possible to figure out what the clearing price for that is.
Okay, let's move to the next question here. Did you have a question here?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Chris McCleary. I work with Tom Lee actually at the Sunlight Foundation, and I wanted to go back to a point that Mr. Brin made earlier about the fundamental rights of the right to know and the right to say. And the question that I wanted to pose to the panel is, are those rights actually fundamental and equally shared anymore, given the disparities in the ability to access information and the disparities in the ability to say, presented by both, access to computing technology or ability to buy television advertising or editorials or whatever? Are those rights actually fundamental and equally shared anymore?
Absolutely not, and that's why we're in danger. But that's where I am sometimes I'm portrayed as being complacent about about light falling on the average person. No, I'm not complacent. I'm as militant against Big Brother as anybody. I just see hiding from elites as utterly futile, and I'd love to see your plan, because, as Riedel said, and as Greenwald spends his entire book whining and whining and whining, don't look at me, when we should be aggressively stripping naked the powers that be in order to apply surveillance.
Okay.
Let me say this real fast. I think we've made actually tremendous progress on both of those, right to know and right to speak. Think about how much you can know and how quickly you can know it now compared to when I was in college, where you'd have to go to libraries and card catalogs and data was much older and much less available. And your right to speak, one person on a Twitter feed can change things. You didn't have that ability. You had to have a television station. Now you can, with the rebound effect and all of that stuff, the echo effect, one person or a small group of people can be heard. Doesn't mean they will be heard, but they have that ability much more so now than they did 20 years ago.
And Watergate probably would have been exposed in about 3 days.
In Watergate,
given all the video cameras.
There would have been a video of the guy breaking in, and that would have been posted within minutes.
And last year we had the most important civil liberties decision in the last 30 years, and hardly anybody talked about it. You now, the Obama administration and the courts, together declared there is a universal right of citizens to film and record their interactions with police, which gives us the fundamental recourse of any free citizen in an uneven power situation.
But not in Maryland.
The only recourse possible, and that's the truth. And now, of course, they're breaking video cameras accidentally.
Yep. Right. Okay.
A cop has just gone to jail for that.
And what you see is not that abuse claims against cops have gone down, but abuse cases by cops have gone down by 90% when you share openness.
Okay, so I'm going to ask our last two questioners to ask their question, and then you guys can either answer those questions or say something else.
Jeremy Pesner, I'll try and be quick. We've heard a lot today about sort of how people sort of change with the times. You've sort of said before, you were talking about your children who post things on networks that you wouldn't have imagined before. So that sort of seems to suggest perhaps that sort of the technological determinism which says if this news more is available, people are going to take advantage of it. But at the same time, while they choose what they post, they also choose what they don't post. And they also choose what they withhold. And I think as more people become aware of exactly what posting on Facebook and other network sites can do, they're also being more selective about what they offer. So sorry, let me just finish up that. So when we consider, again, NSA and other people who are grabbing our data without our knowledge, and we look back to the mail system in which there were laws in place to prevent the government from reading our mail, what do we get down to in terms of our fundamental morals, which don't change, our fundamental morals, actions, and persuasions, which don't change based on the latest technology? And what do you think we have in terms of our privacy and ability to control ourselves in that context?
Once again, proving that the last question is always the hardest.
Yeah, well, I'm Gary Arlen, and I'm going to ask you the question. You're a bunch of wonks. You're policy and tech wonks. I looked at your title, Mike, and I thought it was great. And then I started thinking, what if it was, why should we keep secrets anymore? Who cares about keeping secrets anymore?
That's a values question. We're geeks.
I gotcha. And if we'd had sociologists and marketers up here, we would have had a whole different perspective of this. I like Greg, it is, right? Your comment about...
That's what I tell everybody.
Good. What you said about your health records, which means something to you and your doctor, means something very different to your the pharmaceutical and insurance companies who really want those records. And by the way, to the lady in the front row, I don't think his interests and your doctor's interests and pharma and the insurance interests are meshing or will mesh. But it's the kind of thing that this conversation could take many different perspectives. How do you want to address it as you go forward?
And I can answer both those questions now with one word, and that is purpose. I think fundamentally the idea of data is collected for a purpose. And when it's used for that purpose, it's fine. It's when data starts getting used for purposes other than which that it's being collected, and for purposes that we as a society haven't accepted as a purpose for it, that we end up with problems. And that's really it. I give my information to my doctor for a purpose. It may be used for a different purpose, for example, for disciplining my doctor who may be committing fraud. That's an acceptable purpose. But to use that data, for example, to allow the police to investigate me for something would be an unacceptable purpose. So I think that's really the limitation that I see.
If I can plug an article by one of my colleagues at Microsoft, Craig Mundy just wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, of all places, on how we need to change our whole approach.
Did you say Clive Bundy?
Craig Mundy, he's super wonk. He wrote a very nice piece on how we need to shift away from trying to control the collection of data to controlling the use. And if government's going to intervene, it needs to be looking at what the data is used for, and we have to be able to better track, using technology, where my data ends up, so that we can actually see that it's used properly. Let's go down the line here. Alan, do you have a last comment on either of those questions, or do you want to explain why Mark is wrong?
Or is it so obvious that it needs no explaining?
No, I was just, I mean, there was so much said there, but the one thing I just wanted to end is that I agree with the point that you had made, that I think that the little guy just doesn't win right now. Maybe it's just from where I sit, and I see the amount of money and power that big corporations have, that politicians have, and that it's becoming more and more secret, that the little guy, how you define that, and I define that mostly as private individuals, and especially low-income groups, who, by the way, only 52% have internet connections, so they're being really left out, are at a complete disadvantage, and where I think that unless we find a way to pull everybody up, we're in trouble of really creating a have and have not society, which you already have in some ways.
Okay, Greg.
For the first question, David brought up a really interesting point about how there seems to be a really visceral battle happening right now between different political interests. And I'm going to chew on that for a while after I leave here, because I think it's very interesting. I think some of what's going on is any resolution to some of the questions that we're talking about in terms of privacy and transparency are going to fundamentally shift the nature of our society, right? And so there is a resistance to having a political conversation because you have to put some very big things on the table to have that conversation, and it's a lot easier to either put your head in the sand and see where technology goes, or to kind of engage in a visceral attack where you defend your territory and force the other information away. So I think it's a very something I'm going to think about, and I think with I was going to say something and it's slipped my mind.
It's almost like we have a digital Cold War and there's a stalemate on both sides. A digital Cold War where there's both sides trying to stop the other side from getting what they want.
The other side of it is going to be if you really put a stamp down and say, well, this is how we're going to treat X or Y, then all of this other stuff kind of starts to follow from that in a way of which we don't know what's going to happen. And people are doing it. It's happening anyway. But I think that there is oh my God, there's I'll think about this tomorrow.
The Cold War
if I make that decision today.
The Cold War was this tension or conflict between totally different mindsets, but we did have mutually assured destruction. And what we have today that could work is mutually assured disclosure. So the big guys have to tell you what data they've got on you, and in return you end up disclosing your data, and you do so willingly because you have mutually assured disclosure. Tom?
I think you're right that we're going to be all living more in public. I think we are now. And I think it's very difficult to anticipate all of the ways that the data we emit will be used in the future, socially or otherwise. It's very strange that people are now conceived of as the totality of everything all the data they've emitted rather than the person they are today. But you can see the evidence of our inability to deal with this in the number of vacancies in the judicial and executive branch, and a number of other ways in which we're reacting to this phenomenon of people being real human beings and our ability to observe it in a pretty prudish way. So I remain optimistic that social mores will change and we'll be able to roll with the punches a little bit more, although I don't see a lot of reason for optimism on that front. However it evolves, though, I think that, the unspoken, except on this panel, I suppose, dynamic is that beyond the individual, this move into the sunlight is not being applied to large, powerful institutions to the degree that it has to be if we're going to have a healthy society.
Okay, a view from the West Coast.
I think that it's important that we realize that the average political mess of the average average citizen is not representative of what's happening. There's a large fraction of America, probably a majority of Americans, who are being agile and want to move ahead and like science. There is a very large minority that is in full snit renunciatory mode and dislikes the future. That's how I see it. But to get back to the topic, another piece of news that nobody's really discussed is the implication of Obamacare. Until last year, in all of these policy discussions, one of the major things that's thought experiments that would be raised in one of these discussions is I'm doing a Google search about cancer, and my insurance policy will go up or I'll be ejected from my insurance policy. And I have not heard that in the discussions for a year. Why? Because of a policy that was passed for other reasons but had its biggest social effect on our transparency and our reciprocal tolerance and all of that by simply removing that failure mode, 90% of it. You might still have problems with an employer, but the insurance aspect. And so what I really would like to say about this is that in this trade-off, if we get the power to look at what the mighty are doing with our information, that's more important than any specific European-style regulation of the information flows. Because if the people can simply see transparently what's going on, and this is my main emphasis in the Transparent Society, then at least we will not have gone down without the opportunity to see what's going on and thrash about it.
So everybody should buy a Windows smartphone with 43 megapixel images to get every detail.
No, I think Microsoft should give those away.
Microsoft should buy a couple of million copies of the Transparent Society and give them away.
It all works. Well, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank the audience for excellent questions. I want to thank everybody in Videoland. This has been as interesting and as multifaceted as I expected it to be, and I hope we can continue the conversation soon. Thank you very much.